this morning they launched ground forces into southern Lebanon, trying to create a buffer space so the 60,000 displaced Israelis in northern Israel can move back. They were worried about Hezbollah maybe launching a Gaza-like attack, at least as I understand it. So after bombing the hell out of Lebanon and hitting the various leadership targets, which apparently they've been successful at doing, now we've got boots on the ground in southern Lebanon. And also, as I note, a little dicey situation, the USS Abraham Lincoln Aircraft Carrier Strike Group is staying there. It was supposed to leave after the Harry S. Truman Carrier Strike Group showed up, but given the warlike environment, we got two carrier groups going to be in the area now.
That's the thing that alarms me the most, because this has every possibility of escalating further. And potentially even drawing in Iran into this war. And that's the part that worries me, because we seem to be cognizant of that fact and seem to be moving down the road. We had Secretary of State Austin last night, I think it was, or maybe it was this morning. I didn't see the time on the statement. But he said, yeah, we agree with everything Israel is doing, but we give a warning to Iran that if they do anything, that we are sending all this firepower to the region, all but declaring that we will also attack Iran if anything happens. And listen, I understand that we have good relations with Israel, et cetera, but we should not be sending the American armed forces to fight on behalf of Israel as a matter of just accord. Just like, of course we will. We don't have this relationship with them. And in fact, the reason we have been sending $3.8 billion every year in security assistance to Israel is so that they can form the preeminent military power and defend themselves, which they have done in every single conflict in their history. There's no reason why this one should be different, but it almost looks like we're eager to join the fight against Iran, and that is a bad move.
Well, and I'll read you the quote, because it was 2 days in a row he made a similar statement. I reiterated, referring to his conversation with his counterpart in Israel, I reiterated the serious consequences for Iran in the event Iran chooses to launch a direct military attack against Israel. Well, I don't be splitting hairs here, but isn't by virtue of Hezbollah and the other terrorist organizations directly controlled by Iran and presumably not acting without approval from Iran, since Iran's the one funding them and has been funding them, that they already have? That's a proxy war. Iran is waging a proxy war against Israel through these terrorist groups, much in the same way we're waging a proxy war against Russia via Ukraine.
Right. There's not a lot of difference there. In fact, there's no difference there, quite frankly. And so for us to say this about Iran, I mean, forget about the double standards for a moment. I'm still concerned about the ease with which we're talking about moving into war. And listen, our Constitution and the 1973 War Powers Act are crystal clear. Only the Congress can take us into war. The commander-in-chief cannot just choose to send our forces into a situation which will result in a conflict unless we or our forces are directly attacked. That's not even on the table right now. So we need to be talking about this at the Congress, but now nobody wants to talk about anything except silly stuff with the election, is relatively speaking. I'm not saying the election is silly, but a lot of the topics are relatively unimportant compared to war and peace, which isn't even on the table. And I think that should change right now.
Well, and I've had conversations with Judge Anna Napolitano, who's on my program every week on Wednesdays, about the last time we declared war was World War II. Yeah, what about the Korean War, Vietnam War, the invasion Iraq? I mean, we could go on and on of all the conflicts we've been in where there has been a declaration of war. And I don't know that hiding behind an authorization for use of military force is constitutionally appropriate, but leave that for the legal scholars to discuss in the constitutional law. But we don't even have an authorization for use of military force unless they're going to rely on one that's, 20 years old by now?
Which, of course, was designed, after 9/11, and has been bastardized and abused beyond belief. Some of those, I think, have actually been retired. At least one of them has. But the 2003 one, I think, is still on the books. But still, I mean, that would just literally be lying. I mean, just call it what it is to try and claim that. But I don't think anyone's even talking about that right now. I think that Biden is just considering going through, almost by just default, of just ordering it, regardless of whether there is or isn't, and no one seems to be concerned about that. But listen, I'm telling you, the reason why is, don't anybody think that if such an event occurred, This would be just like what we did with launching some missiles into Syria a few times in the last 15 or 20 years. This would be a war that could draw us in, and it would be a lot worse, and it could go substantially worse. So this needs to be front and center on our radars right now.
Well, you have Iran telling Hezbollah and the other terrorist organizations to attack Israel, basically. I get that, proxy war. But in dealing with Iran directly, we are taking on more than just Iran. We would be also dealing with their now best friends, Russia and other powers that hate us. I mean, the Chinese Communist Party, for example, has a cozier relationship with Russia and Iran than they did before these conflicts broke out. It's almost as if we're pushing them into each other's arms.
Yeah, not almost. We definitely are pushing them into each other's arms, and especially heading into now listening. I think 3 weeks away, this BRICS conference, in which all these nations are trying to get together to form an expanding economic competition to the G7 and to the Western way. They have every interest in keeping this thing, off the table. I think Russia and China, especially, they really want this BRICS conference to come off without a hitch. And so they probably don't want any conflict at all right now. But that's only 3 weeks away. After that case, I think that the situation could change dramatically because Russia is dependent to a large extent on Iran. And for them to continue to be able to provide the drones and the missiles and other things that they're doing with the Russian side. And I don't think that the Russians would just allow Iran to be destroyed, especially if the U.S. joined into a war against them. And everything could be on the table if that happens.
Yeah, we call that World War III, or at least tiptoeing around it without saying it out loud. Daniel, I can't come up to any other conclusion. And do we not have ourselves to blame for a variety of reasons? But the sanctions that previously were in place were pretty tough sanctions on Iran. As soon as I remember the pallets of cash that Barack Obama dropped off. Then we had a period of time with the Trump administration. Biden lifted sanctions on Iran. And of course, that frees up money for them to fund terrorists and build drones for the Russians or whoever. I mean, what of the sanctions and why did we lift them in the first place?
Listen, if we're being honest, we got to back up even before that. And whether we liked it or not, Obama's 2015 JCPOA, the nuclear deal, put significant constraints on the Iranian regime, and their nuclear stockpiles were barely anything at all. Their centrifuges were hardly any, just a handful for research. But since we got out of the JCPOA, all those constraints came off, and now then all those amounts and types of centrifuges and everything else are at the table because we lost all of our leverage. And then, of course, we put sanctions on, and then to try to get them back off. All that was a mess, no doubt. But really, it started when we got out of the JCPOA and took the constraints off. And so naturally, they went in the opposite direction. So we do have ourselves to blame, and our reactions since that time have only compounded it.
All right. Well, what of the red line? Serious consequences, and I guess we can all define what serious consequences for Iran might mean if they got directly involved. But is this another one of those red lines in the sand that we just sort of ignore after the red line is crossed in order to avoid this broader global war from breaking out?
Listen, I tell you, I'm a little more concerned with some of the statements made by Netanyahu. I guess right before all this stuff started, when he all but called out Iran. So as his troops were on the border ready to invade into Lebanon, he gave a warning not to the Lebanese people, but to the Iranian people, and said, when your government falls, and something's going to happen much earlier than you think, when you're going to be free, then all of these things can happen, which tells me he's already thinking about going in that direction. Because I think, listen, we got to be honest, I think that Netanyahu has, and his government, not just him personally, has said, all right, this is our golden opportunity for our existence. We're going to get rid of the Palestinian problem, the Hezbollah problem, and the Iranian problem all at one time. But the only way he can do that is if he draws the U.S. into it. And that's why we should put the brakes on and say, listen, we're not going to fight a war for you. So do not start one with Iran. Defend yourself straight up, no question about it. But do not expand beyond this and start a war that you can't finish on your own.
Well, and underline that by saying, hey, by the way, we're going to need congressional approval if we do choose to join the fight, and we don't 100%. Have it right now. So there isn't any guarantee that it's going to happen. Enter Constitution. Daniel Davis, Deep Dive. Search for him online. You find his podcast. Always enjoyed the segment, Daniel. Have a wonderful week, my friend. We'll talk next Tuesday.